Hello and welcome. I'm Sam Califer, your host for Vision, the show all about the College of Arts and Sciences. Today I'm joined by Josh Foreman, an instructor in the Department of Communication, who is also the author of the Hidden History book series. So Josh, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I love getting to talk to you about your books. This is a series of books that you and your longtime friend Ryan Starrett have co-authored together, and you just published a new one. But before we get into that, I would love to just hear, what inspired y'all to start this series, and what is it all about?
Well, Ryan and I, we've known each other since we were in a tumbling class when we were like 3 years old.
Okay.
And we were best friends all through elementary school, high school, college, everything. And we used to, I remember being in high school and we would talk about doing a book one day and going around Mississippi and interviewing people or something. And then we both went our separate ways for about 12 years. He went to Dallas, and then he went to North Texas, and I went to South Korea, and I lived for a long time, and then I went to New Hampshire. But anyway, we came back to Mississippi at the same time in about 2017, and we were sitting at Broad Street in Jackson, and he said, "Would you want to write a book about Jackson?"
Yeah.
And I had just done an MFA in nonfiction writing, and I was like, that's exactly what I want to do.
Yeah.
And so we proposed a book about Jackson to the History Press, and they gave us a contract. We wrote it, and then ever since then, we've just been exploring Mississippi and also New Orleans and some of the areas around Mississippi.
Sure. Yeah, it's so cool. I love to hear about, professors or anyone who does this kind of academic work. And it always comes from this place of genuine interest, and it's just something that y'all have thought about. And also, it always comes back to home and where you're from. And so it's cool that y'all go on your own professional careers and come back and then have this idea to write a series all about Mississippi and its history. And anyone who's from Mississippi, we know there's so much rich history here, so much of world history and the national history can kind of be traced back here in certain ways. And so I love the series, and the newest one you just published is the Hidden Histories of Vicksburg. You have your copy here. So yeah, tell us what it was like to write that book, and how do you choose what to include and what not to?
Well, we've written, I want to say this is our 6th or 7th Hidden History. So we're just moving around Mississippi at this point, and Vicksburg was one of the more notable places that we had not written about, so we just decided it's worthy of writing about.
Definitely.
And I'm from the Jackson area, and so is Ryan, and Vicksburg's close, and I spent a decent amount of time in Vicksburg when I was growing up, so we just had an interest in it. But what I like to do for when I find stories for our books is I really do like to find hidden stories, and if it's been written about before a lot, I try to avoid it.
Right.
And I love to go find the little truly unknown stories. So for this particular book, I found one story by it's a book of poetry written by this guy named Edwin A.
Okay.
And it was published in I want to say it was the 1840s, 44 or something like that. And the entire book, which is over 100 pages, is about Vicksburg. So he had lived, he was a Yankee. He never says where exactly he's from,
right.
But he had lived in Vicksburg when Vicksburg was really a young boom town. And he was, in my chapter I say that he was the prototype of the incel, like this modern incel.
Okay, sure.
Because he was desperate to meet a woman, but the women would not give him the time of day. Like they would literally mock him, shun him.
Right.
And he invented in his poetry. He wrote a 100-page poem about Vicksburg, and about how one of the major themes of the poem is about how the women up north are better, and the women here don't give him the time of day.
Right.
He's just very disgruntled.
Yeah.
But anyway, no one had ever written about that book.
Right.
Like, I was like, man, no one's ever I don't even know if anyone's ever read this book.
Yeah.
The Library of Congress had preserved it digitally, and so I read the whole book. I'm like, this is pretty good.
Yeah.
Like, pretty interesting.
Yeah. How did you find out about him? Like, what does that process look like?
It always comes about by, I like to do just blind reading. So
Sure.
one of my favorite places to do research is newspapers.com.
Oh,
So
sure.
they just digitize like millions of pages
Right.
of newspaper from going back hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm writing about Vicksburg, I'll just pick a year and I'll just start reading old newspapers.
Sure.
And there's always stories where you'll read a story, a snippet. I remember in the Jackson book, there was an ad for a runaway slave. It's like, and then you start to realize like, oh, there's a lot of ads for runaway slaves. And it's
Right.
like, so they were, the newspaper was like how they would spread word about runaway slaves.
Right.
And then we wrote a chapter about runaway slaves. It's
Right.
like, so sometimes it just comes out of just blind reading.
Right.
This Vicksburg book, I think I was searching for books that had been written about Vicksburg, and somehow I found that one in the Library of Congress
Sure.
catalog.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just started reading it, and I realized, like, this is pretty interesting.
Yeah, and that's what I like about all the collections that y'all have written. It really feels like y'all have taken the time to dig through it. It's stuff I've never heard before. The Hidden Histories of the Natchez Trace.
Yeah.
It talks about how Lewis and Clark were on the trace.
Yeah.
And everyone knows that story, but no one knew about that. And Vicksburg is so similar. It was the key to the South. And it was a booming, port city there for a bit. And so to get to see what it was like in that time, and just so many different things, because one, you get to see how different it was, and just they're talking about things that we've never dealt with. But then also there's a lot of similarities. Even so long ago, people who are just like that guy. And so it's such an interesting peer into, the past. So it's so interesting. What would you say, is there another interesting fact that really stood out to you from Vicksburg that you learned?
Yeah, I think the theme, I was looking back over the chapters that I wrote for this book, and one of the themes of my stories is, and of the whole book is, Vicksburg really was nothing around the early 1800s. It was nothing. There was no city there. And it was founded in the I think it was 1819. And then it became, within 20 years, it had become like a major commercial hub for Mississippi.
Sure.
Like all of the agricultural products and cotton were going there, and then they were going down the Mississippi River. And so you got to see, the way I look at it, it's the germination of Mississippi culture in some way.
Oh, sure.
Like you have all of these, you have a city that's created from nothing, and then you have to have a culture that gets created around the city. And there was it was a frontier, so there was the rough frontier elements where, like mob justice, that was a recurring element here.
Interesting, yeah.
But when you have a city that's becoming successful, and then the populace wants to be respectable.
Right.
So you have this rough populace who's come from all over the place to settle in Vicksburg.
Right.
And they commit mob justice, but they don't want to be perceived as the type of vigilantes or the type of people who would commit mob justice. So they try to justify it.
Yeah,
and they say, well, actually, it's actually virtuous that we would do this. This is the swift execution of justice.
Right.
The most famous story of mob justice in Vicksburg or lynching, was the Vicksburg gamblers. And it was in that very early 1830s, I think it was the 1830s, there were, Vicksburg was known as a city, like a refuge for gamblers,
Okay.
like, riverboat gamblers.
Right.
And the city really got fed up with losing money to them, and they were known to be very unscrupulous, so they would, cheat people. And at the 4th of July barbecue, I think it was 1835, one of the gamblers he got drunk. Everybody was probably drunk, and he made a scene and fought with some people, and the local militia had to kick him out. And anyway, it led to them decreeing, like, all gamblers have to leave the city.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And so a few of them did not. Many of them did, but a few did not. So this mob went to go and actually capture them, and it ended up turning into a gunfight. And then they
Wow.
took 5 of them to the city square and hung them.
Sounds like the Wild West. That's crazy.
It was the Wild West.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, legitimately,
Yeah.
it was the Wild West.
And in reading, I've read the Hidden Histories of the Natchez Trace, and you really get that feel, you know, before everything was set in stone and Mississippi is just becoming a place. That's what the stories deal with, this like nation building, community, like who are we as a people, you know? So everyone's coming to Vicksburg, they have to define themselves, and then when you go there today, you see those traces still there.
Yeah.
Like gambling, is still a huge part of Vicksburg culture. So yeah, that's kind of what you're dealing with, and they're such interesting stories. They are, you know, historical, but you take a creative approach to your writing. So interesting. You were just talking about the theme. We've got about a minute or two left. I would love to hear what you've just learned through writing the series as a whole. What is the hidden history of Mississippi, if you had to say it?
You know, you mentioned how world culture kind of converged on Mississippi, and it really did.
Yeah.
So you really see that Mississippi is the product of many different cultures coming together, oftentimes violently, but sometimes peacefully, and many different political powers, you know, fighting for control, and eventually, you know, we get Mississippi out of that.
Right.
So I think our heritage in Mississippi is much more complicated than a lot of people realize.
Yeah, definitely. I think anyone, you kind of just start to assume the place you're from, and it's not interesting, and other places are interesting, and that's why you want to go there. But I think there's always a history in a place, and if you're from there, it's kind of up to you to do that work and to dig it up and figure out, you know, why does Mississippi matter? Why is Mississippi the way it is today? So just really appreciate all the work you do. You and Ryan are a great team, and some great books that y'all have written. So wanted to highlight them today. So thank you for being my guest.
Yeah, thank you, Sam.
Yeah,
It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Go check out Hidden Histories of Vicksburg. And to our audience, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.